Chapter 7: The Dancing Girl of Sidi Isa. Tarzan's first mission did not bid fair to be either exciting or vastly important. There was a certain lieutenant of Spays whom the government had reason to suspect of improper relations with a great European power. This Lieutenant Journois, who was at present stationed at Sidi Bel Abs, had recently been attached to the general staff, where certain information of great military value had come into his possession in the ordinary routine of his duties. It was this information which the government suspected the great power was bartering for with the officer. It was at most but a vague hint dropped by a certain notorious Parisienne in a jealous mood that had caused suspicion to rest upon the lieutenant. But general staffs are jealous of their secrets, and treason so serious a thing that even a hint of it may not be safely neglected. And so it was that Tarzan had come to Algeria in the guise of an American hunter and traveler to keep a close eye upon Lieutenant Journois. He had looked forward with keen delight to again seeing his beloved Africa, but this northern aspect of it was so different from his tropical jungle home that he might as well have been back in Paris for all the heart thrills of homecoming that he experienced. At Oran he spent a day wandering through the narrow, crooked alleys of the Arab quarter, enjoying the strange new sights. The next day found him at Sidi Bel Abbas, where he presented his letters of introduction to both civil and military authorities, letters which gave no clue to the real significance of his mission. Tarzan possessed a sufficient command of English to enable him to pass among Arabs and Frenchmen as an American, and that was all that was required of it. When he met an Englishman he spoke French, in order that he might not betray himself, but occasionally talked in English to foreigners who understood that tongue, but could not note the slight imperfections of accent and pronunciation that were his. Here he became acquainted with many of the French officers and soon became a favorite among them. He met Journois, whom he found to be a taciturn, dyspeptic-looking man of about 40, having little or no social intercourse with his fellows. For a month nothing of moment occurred. Journois apparently had no visitors, nor did he on his occasional visits to the town hold communication with any who might even by the wildest flight of imagination be construed into secret agents of a foreign power. Tarzan was beginning to hope that, after all, the rumor might have been false, when suddenly Journois was ordered to Bou Saada in the Petite Sahara far to the south. A company of Spays and 3 officers were to relieve another company already stationed there. Fortunately, one of the officers, Captain Gerard, had become an excellent friend of Tarzan's, and so when the ape-man suggested that he should embrace the opportunity of accompanying him to Bou Saada, where he expected to find hunting, it caused not the slightest suspicion. At Burroughs the detachment detrained, and the balance of the journey was made in the saddle. As Tarzan was dickering at Burroughs for a mount, he caught a brief glimpse of a man in European clothes eyeing him from the doorway of a native coffee house, but as Tarzan looked the man turned and entered the little, low-ceilinged mud hut. And but for a haunting impression that there had been something familiar about the face or figure of the fellow, Tarzan gave the matter no further thought. The march to Amal was fatiguing to Tarzan, whose equestrian experiences hitherto had been confined to a course of riding lessons in a Parisian academy, and so it was that he quickly sought the comforts of a bed in the Hotel Grossat, while the officers and troops took up their quarters at the military post. Although Tarzan was called early the following morning, the company of Spahis was on the march before he had finished his breakfast. He was hurrying through his meal that the soldiers might not get too far in advance of him, when he glanced through the door connecting the dining room with the bar. To his surprise, he saw Journois standing there in conversation with the very stranger he had seen in the coffee house at Burroughs the day previous. He could not be mistaken, for there was the same strangely familiar attitude and figure, though the man's back was toward him. As his eyes lingered on the two, Journois looked up and caught the intent expression on Tarzan's face. The stranger was talking in a low whisper at the time, but the French officer immediately interrupted him, and the two at once turned away and passed out of the range of Tarzan's vision. This was the first suspicious occurrence that Tarzan had ever witnessed in connection with Journois' actions, but he was positive that the men had left the barroom solely because Journois had caught Tarzan's eyes upon them. Then there was the persistent impression of familiarity about the stranger to further augment the ape-man's belief that here at length was something which would bear watching. A moment later Tarzan entered the barroom, but the men had left, nor did he see aught of them in the street beyond, though he found a pretext to ride to various shops before he set out after the column which had now considerable start of him. He did not overtake them until he reached Sidi Isa shortly after noon, where the soldiers had halted for an hour's rest. Here he found Journois with the column, but there was no sign of the stranger. It was market day at Sidi Isa, and the numberless caravans of camels coming in from the desert, and the crowds of bickering Arabs in the marketplace filled Tarzan with a consuming desire to remain for a day that he might see more of these sons of the desert. Thus it was that the company of spies marched on that afternoon toward Busada without him. He spent the hours until dark wandering about the market in company with a youthful Arab, one Abdul, who had been recommended to him by the innkeeper as a trustworthy servant and interpreter. Here Tarzan purchased a better mount than the one he had selected at Burera, and entering into conversation with the stately Arab to whom the animal had belonged, learned that the seller was Kador ben Saden, sheikh of a desert tribe far south of Jelfa. Through Abdul, Tarzan invited his new acquaintance to dine with him. As the three were making their way through the crowds of marketers, camels, donkeys, and horses that filled the marketplace with a confusing babble of sounds, Abdul plucked at Tarzan's sleeve. "Look, master, behind us," and he turned, pointing at a figure which disappeared behind a camel as Tarzan turned. "He has been following us about all afternoon," continued Abdul. "I caught only a glimpse of an Arab in a dark blue burnous and white turban," replied Tarzan. "Is it he you mean?" "Yes. I suspected him because he seems a stranger here without other business than following us, which is not the way of the Arab who is honest, and also because he keeps the lower part of his face hidden, only his eyes showing. He must be a bad man. Or he would have honest business of his own to occupy his time." "He is on the wrong scent then," Abdul replied Tarzan, "for no one here can have any grievance against me. This is my first visit to your country and none knows me. He will soon discover his error and cease to follow us." "Unless he be bent on robbery," returned Abdul. "Then all we can do is wait until he is ready to try his hand upon us," laughed Tarzan, "and I warrant that he will get his bellyful of robbing now that we are prepared for him." And so he dismissed the subject from his mind, though he was destined to recall it before many hours through a most unlooked-for occurrence. Kador ben Saden, having dined well, prepared to take leave of his host. With dignified protestations of friendship, he invited Tarzan to visit him in his wild domain, where the antelope, the stag, the boar, the panther, and the lion might still be found in sufficient numbers to tempt an ardent huntsman. On his departure, the ape-man with Abdul wandered again into the streets of Sidi Isa, where he was soon attracted by the wild din of sound coming from the open doorway of one of the numerous cafes Moors. It was after 8, and the dancing was in full swing as Tarzan entered. The room was filled to repletion with Arabs. All were smoking and drinking their thick, hot coffee. Tarzan and Abdul found seats near the center of the room, though the terrific noise produced by the musicians upon their Arab drums and pipes would have rendered a seat farther from them more acceptable to the quiet, loving ape-man. A rather good-looking old Nail was dancing, and perceiving Tarzan's European clothes and scenting a generous gratuity, she threw her silken handkerchief upon his shoulder to be rewarded with a franc. When her place upon the floor had been taken by another, the bright-eyed Abdul saw her in conversation with two Arabs at the far side of the room, near a side door that led upon an inner court, around the gallery of which were the rooms occupied by the girls who danced in this café. At first he thought nothing of the matter, but presently he noticed from the corner of his eye one of the men nod in their direction, and the girl turn and shoot a furtive glance at Tarzan. Then the Arabs melted through the doorway into the darkness of the court. When it came again the girl's turn to dance, she hovered close to Tarzan, and for the ape-man alone were her sweetest smiles. Many an ugly scowl was cast upon the tall European by swarthy, dark-eyed sons of the desert, but neither smiles nor scowls produced any outwardly visible effect upon him. Again the girl cast her handkerchief upon his shoulder, and again was she rewarded with a franc piece. As she was sticking it upon her forehead, after the custom of her kind, she bent low toward Tarzan, whispering a quick word in his ear. "There are two without in the court," she said quickly in broken French, "who would harm monsieur. At first I promised to lure you to them, but you have been kind, and I cannot do it. Go quickly, before they find that I have failed them. I think that they are very bad men." Tarzan thanked the girl, assuring her that he would be careful, and having finished her dance, she crossed to the little doorway and went out into the court. But Tarzan did not leave the café as she had urged. For another half-hour nothing unusual occurred. Then a surly-looking Arab entered the café from the street. He stood near Tarzan, where he deliberately made insulting remarks about the European, but as they were in his native tongue, Tarzan was entirely innocent of their purport, until Abdul took it upon himself to enlighten him. "This fellow is looking for trouble," warned Abdul. "He is not alone. In fact, in case of a disturbance, nearly every man here would be against you. It would be better to leave quietly, master." "Ask the fellow what he wants," commanded Tarzan. He says that the dog of a Christian insulted the old nail, who belongs to him. He means trouble, monsieur. Tell him that I did not insult his or any other old nail, that I wish him to go away and leave me alone, that I have no quarrel with him, nor has he any with me. He says, replied Abdul, after delivering this message to the Arab, that, besides being a dog yourself, that you are the son of one, and that your grandmother was a hyena. Incidentally, you are a liar. The attention of those nearby had now been attracted by the altercation, and the sneering laughs that followed this torrent of invective easily indicated the trend of the sympathies of the majority of the audience. Tarzan did not like being laughed at, neither did he relish the terms applied to him by the Arab, but he showed no sign of anger as he arose from his seat upon the bench. A half-smile played about his lips, but of a sudden a mighty fist shot into the face of the scowling Arab, and back of it were the terrible muscles of the ape-man. At the instant that the man fell, a half-dozen fierce plainsmen sprang into the room from where they had apparently been waiting for their cue in the street before the café, with cries of "Kill the unbeliever!" And down with the dog of a Christian they made straight for Tarzan. A number of the younger Arabs in the audience sprang to their feet to join in the assault upon the unarmed white man. Tarzan and Abdul were rushed back toward the end of the room by the very force of numbers opposing them. The young Arab remained loyal to his master, and with drawn knife fought at his side. With tremendous blows the ape-man felled all who came within reach of his powerful hands. He fought quietly and without a word, upon his lips the same half-smile they had worn as he rose to strike down the man who had insulted him. It seemed impossible that either he or Abdul could survive the sea of wicked-looking swords and knives that surrounded them, but the very numbers of their assailants proved the best bulwark of their safety. So closely packed was the howling, cursing mob that no weapon could be wielded to advantage, and none of the Arabs dared use a firearm for fear of wounding one of his compatriots. Finally, Tarzan succeeded in seizing one of the most persistent of his attackers. With a quick wrench he disarmed the fellow, and then, holding him before them as a shield, he backed slowly beside Abdul toward the little door which led into the inner courtyard. At the threshold he paused for an instant, and lifting the struggling Arab above his head, hurled him, as though from a catapult, full in the faces of his on-pressing fellows. Then Tarzan and Abdul stepped into the semi-darkness of the court. The frightened old nails were crouching at the tops of the stairs which led to their respective rooms, the only light in the courtyard coming from the sickly candles which each girl had stuck with its own grease to the woodwork of her door frame, the better to display her charms to those who might happen to traverse the dark enclosure. Scarcely had Tarzan and Abdul emerged from the room ere a revolver spoke close at their backs from the shadows beneath one of the stairways, and as they turned to meet this new antagonist, two muffled figures sprang toward them, firing as they came. Tarzan leaped to meet these two new assailants. The foremost lay, a second later, in the trampled dirt of the court, disarmed and groaning from a broken wrist. Abdul's knife found the vitals of the second in the instant that the fellow's revolver missed fire as he held it to the faithful Arab's forehead. The maddened horde within the café were now rushing out in pursuit of their quarry. The old nails had extinguished their candles at a cry from one of their number, and the only light within the yard came feebly from the open and half-blocked door of the café. Tarzan had seized a sword from the man who had fallen before Abdul's knife, and now he stood waiting for the rush of men that was coming in search of them through the darkness. Suddenly he felt a light hand upon his shoulder from behind, and a woman's voice whispering, "Quick, monsieur, this way. Follow me." "Come," Abdul said Tarzan in a low tone to the youth, "we can be no worse off elsewhere than we are here." The woman turned and led them up the narrow stairway that ended at the door of her quarters. Tarzan was close beside her. He saw the gold and silver bracelets upon her bare arms, the strings of gold coin that depended from her hair ornaments, and the gorgeous colors of her dress. He saw that she was a old nail, and instinctively he knew that she was the same who had whispered the warning in his ear earlier in the evening. As they reached the top of the stairs, they could hear the angry crowd searching the yard beneath. "Soon they will search here," whispered the girl. "They must not find you, for, though you fight with the strength of many men, they will kill you in the end. Hasten, you can drop from the farther window of my room to the street beyond. Before they discover that you are no longer in the court of the buildings, you will be safe within the hotel." But even as she spoke, several men had started up the stairway at the head of which they stood. There was a sudden cry from one of the searchers. They had been discovered. Quickly the crowd rushed for the stairway. The foremost assailant leaped quickly upward, but at the top he met the sudden sword that he had not expected. The quarry had been unarmed before. With a cry, the man toppled back upon those behind him. Like 10 pins they rolled down the stairs. The ancient and rickety structure could not withstand the strain of this unwanted weight and jarring. With a creaking and rending of breaking wood, it collapsed beneath the Arabs, leaving Tarzan, Abdul, and the girl alone upon the frail platform at the top. "Come," cried the Ouled Nail. "They will reach us from another stairway through the room next to mine. We have not a moment to spare." Just as they were entering the room, Abdul heard and translated a cry from the yard below for several to hasten to the street and cut off escape from that side. "We are lost now," said the girl simply. We questioned Tarzan. "Yes, monsieur," she responded, "they will kill me as well. Have I not aided you?" This put a different aspect on the matter. Tarzan had rather been enjoying the excitement and danger of the encounter. He had not for an instant supposed that either Abdul or the girl could suffer except through accident, and he had only retreated just enough to keep from being killed himself. He had had no intention of running away until he saw that he was hopelessly lost were he to remain. Alone he could have sprung into the midst of that close-packed mob, and laying about him after the fashion of Numa, the lion, have struck the Arabs with such consternation that escape would have been easy. Now he must think entirely of these two faithful friends. He crossed to the window which overlooked the street. In a minute there would be enemies below. Already he could hear the mob clambering the stairway to the next quarters. They would be at the door beside him in another instant. He put a foot upon the sill and leaned out, but he did not look down. Above him, within arm's reach, was the low roof of the building. He called to the girl. She came and stood beside him. He put a great arm about her and lifted her across his shoulder. "Wait here until I reach down for you from above," he said to Abdul. "In the meantime, shove everything in the room against that door. It may delay them long enough." Then he stepped to the sill of the narrow window with the girl upon his shoulders. "Hold tight," he cautioned her. A moment later he had clambered to the roof above with the ease and dexterity of an ape. Setting the girl down, he leaned far over the roof's edge, calling softly to Abdul. The youth ran to the window. "Your hand," whispered Tarzan. The men in the room beyond were battering at the door. With a sudden crash it fell splintering in, and at the same instant Abdul felt himself lifted like a feather onto the roof above. They were not a moment too soon, for as the men broke into the room which they had just quitted, a dozen more rounded the corner in the street below and came running to a spot beneath the girl's window. Chapter 8: The Fight in the Desert. As the three squatted upon the roof above the quarters of the Ouled Nails, they heard the angry cursing of the Arabs in the room beneath. Abdul translated from time to Tarzan. "They are berating those in the street below now," said Abdul, "for permitting us to escape so easily. Those in the street say that we did not come that way, that we are still within the building, and that those above, being too cowardly to attack us, are attempting to deceive them into believing that we have escaped. In a moment they will have fighting of their own to attend to if they continue their brawling." Presently those in the building gave up the search and returned to the cafe. A few remained in the street below, smoking and talking. Tarzan spoke to the girl, thanking her for the sacrifice she had made for him, a total stranger. "I liked you," she said simply. "You are unlike the others who come to the cafe. You did not speak coarsely to me. The manner in which you gave me money was not an insult." "What shall you do after tonight?" he asked. "You cannot return to the cafe. Can you even remain with safety in Sidi Aissa?" "Tomorrow it will be forgotten," she replied. "But I should be glad if it might be that I need never return to this or another cafe. I have not remained because I wished to. I have been a prisoner." "A prisoner," ejaculated Tarzan incredulously. "A slave would be the better word," she answered. "I was stolen in the night from my father's douar by a band of marauders. They brought me here and sold me to the Arab who keeps this cafe. It has been nearly 2 years now since I saw the last of mine own people. They are very far to the south. They never come to Sidi Aissa." "You would like to return to your people?" asked Tarzan. "Then I shall promise to see you safely so far as Bou Saada at least. There we can doubtless arrange with the commandant to send you the rest of the way." "Oh, monsieur," she cried, "how can I ever repay you? You cannot really mean that you will do so much for a poor Ouled Nail. But my father can reward you, and he will, for is he not a great sheikh? He is Kador ben Saden." "Kador ben Saden," ejaculated Tarzan. "Why, Kador Ben Sadin is in Sidi Isa this very night. He dined with me, but a few hours since." "My father in Sidi Isa," cried the amazed girl. "Allah be praised then, for I am indeed saved." HSS cautioned Abdul. "Listen." From below came the sound of voices, quite distinguishable upon the still night air. Tarzan could not understand the words, but Abdul and the girl translated. "They have gone now," said the latter. "It is you they want, monsieur. One of them said that the stranger who had offered money for your slaying lay in the house of Akmi Din Solef with a broken wrist, but that he had offered a still greater reward if some would lay in wait for you upon the road to Busada and kill you." "It is he who followed monsieur about the market today," exclaimed Abdul. "I saw him again within the cafe, him and another, and the two went out into the inner court after talking with this girl here. It was they who attacked and fired upon us as we came out of the cafe. Why do they wish to kill you, monsieur?" "I do not know," replied Tarzan, and then, after a pause, but he did not finish, for the thought that had come to his mind, while it seemed the only reasonable solution of the mystery, appeared at the same time quite improbable. Presently the men in the street went away. The courtyard and the cafe were deserted. Cautiously Tarzan lowered himself to the sill of the girl's window. The room was empty. He returned to the roof and let Abdul down. Then he lowered the girl to the arms of the waiting Arab. From the window Abdul dropped the short distance to the street below, while Tarzan took the girl in his arms and leaped down as he had done on so many other occasions in his own forest with a burden in his arms. A little cry of alarm was startled from the girl's lips, but Tarzan landed in the street with but an imperceptible jar and lowered her in safety to her feet. She clung to him for a moment. "How strong monsieur is and how active," she cried. "Eladria the Black Lion himself is not more so." "I should like to meet this Eladria of yours," he said. "I have heard much about him." "And you come to the douar of my father, you shall see him," said the girl. "He lives in a spur of the mountains north of us, and comes down from his lair at night to rob my father's douar. With a single blow of his mighty paw he crushes the skull of a bull, and woe betide the belated wayfarer who meets Eladria broad at night." Without further mishap they reached the hotel. The sleepy landlord objected strenuously to instituting a search for Kador Ben Sadin until the following morning, but a piece of gold put a different aspect on the matter. So that a few moments later a servant had started to make the rounds of the lesser native hostelries where it might be expected that a desert sheikh would find congenial associations. Tarzan had felt it necessary to find the girl's father that night, for fear he might start on his homeward journey too early in the morning to be intercepted. They had waited perhaps half an hour when the messenger returned with Kador Ben Sadin. The old sheikh entered the room with a questioning expression upon his proud face. "Monsieur has done me the honor," he commenced, and then his eyes fell upon the girl. With outstretched arms he crossed the room to meet her. "My daughter," he cried. "Allah is merciful," and tears dimmed the martial eyes of the old warrior. When the story of her abduction and her final rescue had been told to Kador Ben Sadin, he extended his hand to Tarzan. "All that is Kador Ben Sadin's is thine, my friend, even to his life," he said very simply, but Tarzan knew that those were no idle words. It was decided that although three of them would have to ride after practically no sleep, it would be best to make an early start in the morning and attempt to ride all the way to Busada in one day. It would have been comparatively easy for the men, but for the girl it was sure to be a fatiguing journey. She, however, was the most anxious to undertake it, for it seemed to her that she could not quickly enough reach the family and friends from whom she had been separated for 2 years. It seemed to Tarzan that he had not closed his eyes before he was awakened, and in another hour the party was on its way south toward Busada. For a few miles the road was good and they made rapid progress, but suddenly it became only a waste of sand into which the horses sank fetlock deep at nearly every step. In addition to Tarzan, Abdul, the sheikh, and his daughter were 4 of the wild plainsmen of the sheikh's tribe who had accompanied him upon the trip to Sidi Isa. Thus 7 guns strong, they entertained little fear of attack by day, and if all went well they should reach Busada before nightfall. A brisk wind enveloped them in the blowing sand of the desert, until Tarzan's lips were parched and cracked. What little he could see of the surrounding country was far from alluring. A vast expanse of rough country rolling in little barren hillocks and tufted here and there with clumps of dreary shrub. Far to the south rose the dim lines of the Saharan Atlas range. How different, thought Tarzan, from the gorgeous Africa of his boyhood. Abdul, always on the alert, looked backward quite as often as he did ahead. At the top of each hillock that they mounted, he would draw in his horse, and turning, scan the country to the rear with utmost care. At last his scrutiny was rewarded. "Look," he cried, "there are 6 horsemen behind us." "Your friends of last evening, no doubt," Monsieur remarked Kador Ben Saden dryly to Tarzan. "No doubt," replied the ape-man. "I am sorry that my society should endanger the safety of your journey. At the next village I shall remain and question these gentlemen, while you ride on. There is no necessity for my being at Bosada tonight, and less still why you should not ride in peace." "If you stop, we shall stop," said Kador Ben Saden. "Until you are safe with your friends or the enemy has left your trail, we shall remain with you. There is nothing more to say." Tarzan nodded his head. He was a man of few words, and possibly it was for this reason as much as any that Kador Ben Saden had taken to him, for if there be one thing that an Arab despises, it is a talkative man. All the balance of the day Abdul caught glimpses of the horsemen in their rear. They remained always at about the same distance. During the occasional halts for rest, and at the longer halt at noon, they approached no closer. "They are waiting for darkness," said Kador Ben Saden. And darkness came before they reached Bosada. The last glimpse that Abdul had of the grim white-robed figures that trailed them just before dusk made it impossible to distinguish them, had made it apparent that they were rapidly closing up the distance that intervened between them and their intended quarry. He whispered this fact to Tarzan, for he did not wish to alarm the girl. The ape-man drew back beside him. "You will ride ahead with the others," Abdul said. "Tarzan, this is my quarrel. I shall wait at the next convenient spot and interview these fellows." "Then Abdul shall wait at thy side," replied the young Arab, nor would any threats or commands move him from his decision. "Very well, then," replied Tarzan. "Here is as good a place as we could wish. Here are rocks at the top of this hillock. We shall remain hidden here and give an account of ourselves to these gentlemen when they appear." They drew in their horses and dismounted. The others riding ahead were already out of sight in the darkness. Beyond them shone the lights of Bosada. Tarzan removed his rifle from its boot and loosened his revolver in its holster. He ordered Abdul to withdraw behind the rocks with the horses so that they should be shielded from the enemy's bullets should they fire. The young Arab pretended to do as he was bid, but when he had fastened the 2 animals securely to a low shrub, he crept back to lie on his belly a few paces behind Tarzan. The ape-man stood erect in the middle of the road, waiting. Nor did he have long to wait. The sound of galloping horses came suddenly out of the darkness below him, and a moment later he discerned the moving blotches of lighter color against the solid background of the night. "Halt," he cried, "or we fire." The white figures came to a sudden stop, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the sound of a whispered counsel, and like ghosts the phantom riders dispersed in all directions. Again the desert lay still about him, yet it was an ominous stillness that foreboded evil. Abdul raised himself to one knee. Tarzan cocked his jungle-trained ears, and presently there came to him the sound of horses walking quietly through the sand to the east of him, to the west, to the north, and to the south. They had been surrounded. Then a shot came from the direction in which he was looking. A bullet whirred through the air above his head, and he fired at the flash of the enemy's gun. Instantly the soundless waste was torn with the quick staccato of guns upon every hand. Abdul and Tarzan fired only at the flashes; they could not yet see their foemen. Presently it became evident that the attackers were circling their position, drawing closer and closer and closer in, as they began to realize the paltry numbers of the party which opposed them. But one came too close, for Tarzan was accustomed to using his eyes in the darkness of the jungle night, than which there is no more utter darkness this side the grave, and with a cry of pain a saddle was emptied. "The odds are evening," Abdul said. Tarzan with a low laugh. But they were still far too one-sided, and when the 5 remaining horsemen whirled at a signal and charged full upon them, it looked as if there would be a sudden ending of the battle. Both Tarzan and Abdul sprang to the shelter of the rocks, that they might keep the enemy in front of them. There was a mad clatter of galloping hoofs, a volley of shots from both sides, and the Arabs withdrew to repeat the maneuver, but there were now only 4 against the 2. For a few moments there came no sound from out of the surrounding blackness. Tarzan could not tell whether the Arabs, satisfied with their losses, had given up the fight, or were waiting farther along the road to waylay them as they proceeded on toward Bosada. But he was not left long in doubt, for now all from one direction came the sound of a new charge. But scarcely had the first gun spoken ere a dozen shots rang out behind the Arabs. There came the wild shouts of a new party to the controversy, and the pounding of the feet of many horses from down the road to Bou Saada. The Arabs did not wait to learn the identity of the oncomers. With a parting volley as they dashed by the position which Tarzan and Abdul were holding, they plunged off along the road towards Sidi Aissa. A moment later, Kaddour Ben Saden and his men dashed up. The old sheikh was much relieved to find that neither Tarzan nor Abdul had received a scratch. Not even had their horses been wounded. They sought out the two men who had fallen before Tarzan's shots, and finding that both were dead, left them where they lay. "Why did you not tell me that you contemplated ambushing those fellows?" asked the sheikh in a hurt tone. "We might have had them all if the 7 of us had stopped to meet them." "Then it would have been useless to stop at all," replied Tarzan, "for had we simply ridden on toward Bou Saada, they would have been upon us presently. And all could have been engaged. It was to prevent the transfer of my own quarrel to another's shoulders that Abdul and I stopped off to question them. Then there is your daughter. I could not be the cause of exposing her needlessly to the marksmanship of 6 men. Kaddour Ben Saden shrugged his shoulders. He did not relish having been cheated out of a fight. The little battle so close to Bou Saada had drawn out a company of soldiers. Tarzan and his party met them just outside the town. The officer in charge halted them to learn the significance of the shots. "A handful of marauders," replied Kaddour Ben Saden. "They attacked 2 of our number who had dropped behind, but when we returned to them, the fellows soon dispersed. They left 2 dead. None of my party was injured." This seemed to satisfy the officer, and after taking the names of the party, he marched his men on toward the scene of the skirmish to bring back the dead men for purposes of identification, if possible. 2 days later, Kaddour Ben Saden with his daughter and followers rode south through the pass below Bou Saada, bound for their home in the far wilderness. The sheikh had urged Tarzan to accompany him, and the girl had added her entreaties to those of her father, but, though he could not explain it to them, Tarzan's duties loomed particularly large after the happenings of the past few days, so that he could not think of leaving his post for an instant. But he promised to come later if it lay within his power to do so, and they had to content themselves with that assurance. During these 2 days, Tarzan had spent practically all his time with Kaddour Ben Saden and his daughter. He was keenly interested in this race of stern and dignified warriors, and embraced the opportunity which their friendship offered to learn what he could of their lives and customs. He even commenced to acquire the rudiments of their language under the pleasant tutorage of the brown-eyed girl. It was with real regret that he saw them depart, and he sat his horse at the opening to the pass, as far as which he had accompanied them, gazing after the little party as long as he could catch a glimpse of them. Here were people after his own heart. Their wild, rough lives, filled with danger and hardship, appealed to this half-savage man as nothing had appealed to him in the midst of the effeminate civilization of the great cities he had visited. Here was a life that excelled even that of the jungle, for here he might have the society of men, real men whom he could honor and respect, and yet be near to the wild nature that he loved. In his head revolved an idea that when he had completed his mission he would resign and return to live for the remainder of his life with the tribe of Kaddour Ben Saden. Then he turned his horse's head and rode slowly back to Bou Saada. The front of the Hotel du Petit Sahara, where Tarzan stopped in Bou Saada, is taken up with the bar, 2 dining rooms, and the kitchens. Both of the dining rooms open directly off the bar, and one of them is reserved for the use of the officers of the garrison. As you stand in the barroom, you may look into either of the dining rooms if you wish. It was to the bar that Tarzan repaired after speeding Kaddour Ben Saden and his party on their way. It was yet early in the morning, for Kaddour Ben Saden had elected to ride far that day, so that it happened that when Tarzan returned there were guests still at breakfast. As his casual glance wandered into the officers' dining room, Tarzan saw something which brought a look of interest to his eyes. Lieutenant Guernois was sitting there, and as Tarzan looked, a white-robed Arab approached, and bending, whispered a few words into the lieutenant's ear. Then he passed on out of the building through another door. In itself the thing was nothing, but as the man had stooped to speak to the officer, Tarzan had caught sight of something which the accidental parting of the man's burnous had revealed. He carried his left arm in a sling. Chapter 9, Numa El Adria. On the same day that Kaddour Ben Saden rode south, the diligence from the north brought Tarzan a letter from Dianot which had been forwarded from Sidi Bel Abbas. It opened the old wound that Tarzan would have been glad to have forgotten, yet he was not sorry that Dianot had written, for one at least of his subjects could never cease to interest the ape man. Here is the letter. My dear Jean, since last I wrote you, I have been across to London on a matter of business. I was there but 3 days. The very first day I came upon an old friend of yours quite unexpectedly in Henrietta Street. Now you never in the world would guess whom. None other than Mr. Samuel T. Philander. But it is true. I can see your look of incredulity. Nor is this all. He insisted that I return to the hotel with him, and there I found the others, Professor Archimedes Q. Porter, Miss Porter, and that enormous black woman, Miss Porter's maid Esmeralda, you will recall. While I was there, Clayton came in. They are to be married soon, or rather sooner, for I rather suspect that we shall receive announcements almost any day. On account of his father's death, it is to be a very quiet affair, only blood relatives. While I was alone with Mr. Philander, the old fellow became rather confidential, said Miss Porter had already postponed the wedding on 3 different occasions. He confided that it appeared to him that she was not particularly anxious to marry Clayton at all, but this time it seems that it is quite likely to go through. Of course they all asked after you, but I respected your wishes in the matter of your true origin, and only spoke to them of your present affairs. Miss Porter was especially interested in everything I had to say about you and asked many questions. I am afraid I took a rather unchivalrous delight in picturing your desire and resolve to go back eventually to your native jungle. I was sorry afterward, for it did seem to cause her real anguish to contemplate the awful dangers to which you wished to return. And yet, she said, I do not know. There are more unhappy fates than the grim and terrible jungle presents to Monsieur Tarzan. At least his conscience will be free from remorse. And there are moments of quiet and restfulness by day, or in vistas of exquisite beauty. You may find it strange that I should say it, who experienced such terrifying experiences in that frightful forest, yet at times I long to return, for I cannot but feel that the happiest moments of my life were spent there. There was an expression of ineffable sadness on her face as she spoke, and I could not but feel that she knew that I knew her secret, and that this was her way of transmitting to you a last tender message from a heart that might still enshrine your memory, though its possessor belonged to another. Clayton appeared nervous and ill at ease while you were the subject of conversation. He wore a worried and harassed expression, yet he was very kindly in his expressions of interest in you. I wonder if he suspects the truth about you. Tennington came in with Clayton. They are great friends, you know. He is about to set out upon one of his interminable cruises in that yacht of his, and was urging the entire party to accompany him. Tried to inveigle me into it too. He is thinking of circumnavigating Africa this time. I told him that his precious toy would take him and some of his friends to the bottom of the ocean one of these days if he didn't get it out of his head that she was a liner or a battleship. I returned to Paris day before yesterday, and yesterday I met the Count and Countess de Coude at the races. They inquired after you. De Coude really seems quite fond of you, doesn't appear to harbor the least ill will. Olga is as beautiful as ever, but a trifle subdued. I imagine that she learned a lesson through her acquaintance with you that will serve her in good stead during the balance of her life. It is fortunate for her and for de Coude as well that it was you and not another man more sophisticated. Had you really paid court to Olga's heart, I am afraid that there would have been no hope for either of you. She asked me to tell you that Nicholas had left France. She paid him 20,000 francs to go away and stay. She is congratulating herself that she got rid of him before he tried to carry out a threat he recently made her that he should kill you at the first opportunity. She said that she should hate to think that her brother's blood was on your hands, for she is very fond of you and made no bones in saying so before the Count. It never for a moment seemed to occur to her that there might be any possibility of any other outcome of a meeting between you and Nicholas. The Count quite agreed with her in that. He added that it would take a regiment of Rokoffs to kill you. He has a most healthy respect for your prowess. I have been ordered back to my ship. She sails from Havre in 2 days under sealed orders. If you will address me in her care, the letters will find me eventually. I shall write to you as soon as another opportunity presents. Your sincere friend, Paul Diahata. I fear, mused Tarzan half aloud, that Olga has thrown away her 20,000 francs. He read over that part of Diarnot's letter several times in which he had quoted from his conversation with Jane Porter. Tarzan derived a rather pathetic happiness from it, but it was better than no happiness at all. The following 3 weeks were quite uneventful. On several occasions Tarzan saw the mysterious Arab, and once again he had been exchanging words with Lieutenant Gernois, but no amount of espionage or shadowing by Tarzan revealed the Arab's lodgings, the location of which Tarzan was anxious to ascertain. Gernois, never cordial, had kept more than ever aloof from Tarzan since the episode in the dining room of the hotel at Omal. His attitude on the few occasions that they had been thrown together had been distinctly hostile. That he might keep up the appearance of the character he was playing, Tarzan spent considerable time hunting in the vicinity of Bou Saada. He would spend entire days in the foothills, ostensibly searching for gazelle, but on the few occasions that he came close enough to any of the beautiful little animals to harm them, he invariably allowed them to escape without so much as taking his rifle from its boot. The ape-man could see no sport in slaughtering the most harmless and defenseless of God's creatures for the mere pleasure of killing. In fact, Tarzan had never killed for pleasure, nor to him was there pleasure in killing. It was the joy of righteous battle that he loved, the ecstasy of victory, and the keen and successful hunt for food in which he pitted his skill and craftiness against the skill and craftiness of another. But to come out of a town filled with food to shoot down a soft-eyed, pretty gazelle, that was crueler than the deliberate and cold-blooded murder of a fellow man. Tarzan would have none of it, and so he hunted alone that none might discover the sham that he was practicing. And once, probably because of the fact that he rode alone, he was like to have lost his life. He was riding slowly through a little ravine when a shot sounded close behind him, and a bullet passed through the cork helmet he wore. Although he turned at once and galloped rapidly to the top of the ravine, there was no sign of any enemy, nor did he see aught of another human being until he reached Bou Saada. Yes, he soliloquized, in recalling the occurrence, Olga has indeed thrown away her 20,000 francs. That night he was Captain Gerard's guest at a little dinner. "Your hunting has not been very fortunate?" questioned the officer. "No," replied Tarzan, "the game hereabout is timid, nor do I care particularly about hunting game birds or antelope. I think I shall move on farther south, and have a try at some of your Algerian lions." "Good," exclaimed the captain. "We are marching toward Djelfa on the morrow. You shall have company that far at least. Lieutenant Gernois and I, with 100 men, are ordered south to patrol a district in which the marauders are giving considerable trouble. Possibly we may have the pleasure of hunting the lion together. What say you?" Tarzan was more than pleased, nor did he hesitate to say so, but the captain would have been astonished had he known the real reason of Tarzan's pleasure. Gernois was sitting opposite the ape-man. He did not seem so pleased with his captain's invitation. "You will find lion hunting more exciting than gazelle shooting," remarked Captain Gerard, "and more dangerous." "Even gazelle shooting has its dangers," replied Tarzan. "Especially when one goes alone. I found it so today. I also found that, while the gazelle is the most timid of animals, it is not the most cowardly." He let his glance rest only casually upon Gernois after he had spoken, for he did not wish the man to know that he was under suspicion or surveillance, no matter what he might think. The effect of his remark upon him, however, might tend to prove his connection with or knowledge of certain recent happenings. Tarzan saw a dull red creep up from beneath Gernois' collar. He was satisfied, and quickly changed the subject. When the column rode south from Bou Saada the next morning, there were 6 Arabs bringing up the rear. "They are not attached to the command," replied Gerard in response to Tarzan's query. "They merely accompany us on the road for companionship." Tarzan had learned enough about Arab character since he had been in Algeria to know that this was no real motive, for the Arab is never overfond of the companionship of strangers, and especially of French soldiers. So his suspicions were aroused, and he decided to keep a sharp eye on the little party that trailed behind the column at a distance of about 1/4 of a mile. But they did not come close enough even during the halts to enable him to obtain a close scrutiny of them. He had long been convinced that there were hired assassins on his trail, nor was he in great doubt but that Rokoff was at the bottom of the plot. Whether it was to be revenge for the several occasions in the past that Tarzan had defeated the Russian's purposes and humiliated him, or was in some way connected with his mission in the Gernois affair, he could not determine. If the latter, and it seemed probable since the evidence he had had that Gernois suspected him, then he had 2 rather powerful enemies to contend with, for there would be many opportunities in the wilds of Algeria, for which they were bound, to dispatch a suspected enemy quietly and without attracting suspicion. After camping at Djelfa for 2 days, the column moved to the southwest, from whence word had come that the marauders were operating against the tribes whose douars were situated at the foot of the mountains. The little band of Arabs who had accompanied them from Busada had disappeared suddenly the very night that orders had been given to prepare for the morrow's march from Jelfa. Tarzan made casual inquiries among the men, but none could tell him why they had left or in what direction they had gone. He did not like the looks of it, especially in view of the fact that he had seen Gernot in conversation with one of them some half-hour after Captain Gerard had issued his instructions relative to the new move. Only Gernot and Tarzan knew the direction of the proposed march. All the soldiers knew was that they were to be prepared to break camp early the next morning. Tarzan wondered if Gernot could have revealed their destination to the Arabs. Late that afternoon they went into camp at a little oasis in which was the douar of a sheikh whose flocks were being stolen and whose herdsmen were being killed. The Arabs came out of their goatskin tents and surrounded the soldiers, asking many questions in the native tongue, for the soldiers were themselves natives. Tarzan, who by this time, with the assistance of Abdul, had picked up quite a smattering of Arab, questioned one of the younger men who had accompanied the sheikh while the latter paid his respects to Captain Gerard. No, he had seen no party of 6 horsemen riding from the direction of Djelfa. There were other oases scattered about, possibly they had been journeying to one of these. Then there were the marauders in the mountains above. They often rode north to Busada in small parties and even as far as Olmal and Bouira. It might indeed have been a few marauders returning to the band from a pleasure trip to one of these cities. Early the next morning, Captain Gerard split his command in 2, giving Lieutenant Gernot command of one party while he headed the other. They were to scour the mountains upon opposite sides of the plain. "And with which detachment will Monsieur Tarzan ride?" asked the captain. "Or maybe it is that Monsieur does not care to hunt marauders." "Oh, I shall be delighted to go," Tarzan hastened to explain. He was wondering what excuse he could make to accompany Gernot. His embarrassment was short-lived and was relieved from a most unexpected source. It was Gernot himself who spoke. "If my captain will forego the pleasure of Monsieur Tarzan's company for this once, I shall esteem it an honor indeed to have Monsieur ride with me today," he said, nor was his tone lacking in cordiality. In fact, Tarzan imagined that he had overdone it a trifle, but even so, he was both astounded and pleased, hastening to express his delight at the arrangement. And so it was that Lieutenant Gernot and Tarzan rode off side by side at the head of the little detachment of spies. Gernot's cordiality was short-lived. No sooner had they ridden out of sight of Captain Gerard and his men than he lapsed once more into his accustomed taciturnity. As they advanced, the ground became rougher. Steadily it ascended toward the mountains, into which they filed through a narrow canon close to noon. By the side of a little rivulet, Gernot called the midday halt. Here the men prepared and ate their frugal meal and refilled their canteens. After an hour's rest they advanced again along the canon until they presently came to a little valley, from which several rocky gorges diverged. Here they halted, while Gernot minutely examined the surrounding heights from the center of the depression. "We shall separate here," he said, several riding into each of these gorges, and then he commenced to detail his various squads and issue instructions to the non-commissioned officers who were to command them. When he had done, he turned to Tarzan. "Monsieur will be so good as to remain here until we return." Tarzan demurred, but the officer cut him short. "There may be fighting for one of these sections," he said, "and troops cannot be embarrassed by civilian non-combatants during action." "But my dear lieutenant," expostulated Tarzan, "I am most ready and willing to place myself under command of yourself or any of your sergeants or corporals and to fight in the ranks as they direct. It is what I came for." "I should be glad to think so," retorted Gernot with a sneer he made no attempt to disguise. "Then shortly you are under my orders, and they are that you remain here until we return. Let that end the matter," and he turned and spurred away at the head of his men. A moment later Tarzan found himself alone in the midst of a desolate mountain fastness. The sun was hot, so he sought the shelter of a nearby tree, where he tethered his horse and sat down upon the ground to smoke. Inwardly he swore at Gernot for the trick he had played upon him. A mean little revenge, thought Tarzan, and then suddenly it occurred to him that the man would not be such a fool as to antagonize him through a trivial annoyance of so petty a description. There must be something deeper than this behind it. With the thought he arose and removed his rifle from its boot. He looked to its loads and saw that the magazine was full. Then he inspected his revolver. After this preliminary precaution he scanned the surrounding heights and the mouths of the several gorges. He was determined that he should not be caught napping. The sun sank lower and lower, yet there was no sign of returning spies. At last the valley was submerged in shadow. Tarzan was too proud to go back to camp until he had given the detachment ample time to return to the valley, which he thought was to have been their rendezvous. With the closing in of night, he felt safer from attack, for he was at home in the dark. He knew that none might approach him so cautiously as to elude those alert and sensitive ears of his. Then there were his eyes too, for he could see well at night, and his nose, if they came toward him from upwind, would apprise him of the approach of an enemy while they were still a great way off. So he felt that he was in little danger, and thus lulled to a sense of security, he fell asleep with his back against the tree. He must have slept for several hours, for when he was suddenly awakened by the frightened snorting and plunging of his horse, the moon was shining full upon the little valley, and there, not 10 paces before him, stood the grim cause of the terror of his mount. Superb, majestic, his graceful tail extended and quivering, and his 2 eyes of fire riveted full upon his prey, stood Numa el-Adria, the black lion. A little thrill of joy tingled through Tarzan's nerves. It was like meeting an old friend after years of separation. For a moment he sat rigid to enjoy the magnificent spectacle of this lord of the wilderness. But now Numa was crouching for the spring. Very slowly Tarzan raised his gun to his shoulder. He had never killed a large animal with a gun in all his life. Heretofore he had depended upon his spear, his poisoned arrows, his rope, his knife, or his bare hands. Instinctively he wished that he had his arrows and his knife. He would have felt surer with them. Numa was lying quite flat upon the ground now, presenting only his head. Tarzan would have preferred to fire a little from one side, for he knew what terrific damage the lion could do if he lived 2 minutes, or even a minute after he was hit. The horse stood trembling in terror at Tarzan's back. The ape-man took a cautious step to one side Numa, but followed him with his eyes. Another step he took, and then another. Numa had not moved. Now he could aim at a point between the eye and the ear. His finger tightened upon the trigger, and as he fired, Numa sprang. At the same instant, the terrified horse made a last frantic effort to escape. The tether parted, and he went careening down the cañon toward the desert. No ordinary man could have escaped those frightful claws when Numa sprang from so short a distance, but Tarzan was no ordinary man. From earliest childhood his muscles had been trained by the fierce exigencies of his existence to act with the rapidity of thought. As quick as was el-Adria, Tarzan of the apes was quicker, and so the great beast crashed against a tree where he had expected to feel the soft flesh of man, while Tarzan, a couple of paces to the right, pumped another bullet into him that brought him clawing and roaring to his side. Twice more Tarzan fired in quick succession, and then el-Adria lay still and roared no more. It was no longer Monsieur Jean Tarzan, it was Tarzan of the apes that put a savage foot upon the body of his savage kill, and raising his face to the full moon, lifted his mighty voice in the weird and terrible challenge of his kind of bull ape had made his kill. And the wild things in the wild mountains stopped in their hunting and trembled at this new and awful voice, while down in the desert the children of the wilderness came out of their goatskin tents and looked toward the mountains, wondering what new and savage scourge had come to devastate their flocks. A half-mile from the valley in which Tarzan stood, a score of white-robed figures bearing long, wicked-looking guns halted at the sound and looked at one another with questioning eyes, but presently, as it was not repeated, they took up their silent, stealthy way toward the valley. Tarzan was now confident that Jernois had no intention of returning for him, but he could not fathom the object that had prompted the officer to desert him, yet leave him free to return to camp. His horse gone, he decided that it would be foolish to remain longer in the mountains, so he set out toward the desert. He had scarcely entered the confines of the cañon when the first of the white-robed figures emerged into the valley upon the opposite side. For a moment they scanned the little depression from behind sheltering boulders, but when they had satisfied themselves that it was empty, they advanced across it. Beneath the tree at one side they came upon the body of el-Adria. With muttered exclamations they crowded about it. Then, a moment later, they hurried down the cañon which Tarzan was threading a brief distance in advance of them. They moved cautiously and in silence, taking advantage of shelter as men do who are stalking man. Chapter 10 Through the Valley of the Shadow. As Tarzan walked down the wild cañon beneath the brilliant African moon, the call of the jungle was strong upon him. The solitude and the savage freedom filled his heart with life and buoyancy. Again he was Tarzan of the apes, every sense alert against the chance of surprise by some jungle enemy, yet treading lightly and with head erect, in proud consciousness of his might. The nocturnal sounds of the mountains were new to him, yet they fell upon his ears like the soft voice of a half-forgotten love. Many he intuitively sensed. There was one that was familiar indeed, the distant coughing of Sheeta, the leopard, but there was a strange note in the final wail which made him doubt. It was a panther he heard. Presently a new sound, a soft, stealthy sound, obtruded itself among the others. No human ears other than the ape-man's would have detected it. At first he did not translate it, but finally he realized that it came from the bare feet of a number of human beings. They were behind him, and they were coming toward him quietly. He was being stalked. In a flash he knew why he had been left in that little valley by Guernois, but there had been a hitch in the arrangements. The men had come too late. Closer and closer came the footsteps. Tarzan halted and faced them, his rifle ready in his hand. Now he caught a fleeting glimpse of a white burnous. He called aloud in French, asking what they would of him. His reply was the flash of a long gun, and with the sound of the shot Tarzan of the apes plunged forward upon his face. The Arabs did not rush out immediately. Instead, they waited to be sure that their victim did not rise. Then they came rapidly from their concealment and bent over him. It was soon apparent that he was not dead. One of the men put the muzzle of his gun to the back of Tarzan's head to finish him, but another waved him aside. "If we bring him alive, the reward is to be greater," explained the latter. So they bound his hands and feet, and picking him up, placed him on the shoulders of 4 of their number. Then the march was resumed toward the desert. When they had come out of the mountains, they turned toward the south, and about daylight came to the spot where their horses stood in care of 2 of their number. From here on their progress was more rapid. Tarzan, who had regained consciousness, was tied to a spare horse which they evidently had brought for the purpose. His wound was but a slight scratch, which had furrowed the flesh across his temple. It had stopped bleeding, but the dried and clotted blood smeared his face and clothing. He had said no word since he had fallen into the hands of these Arabs, nor had they addressed him other than to issue a few brief commands to him when the horses had been reached. For 6 hours they rode rapidly across the burning desert, avoiding the oases near which their way led. About noon they came to a douar of about 20 tents. Here they halted, and as one of the Arabs was releasing the alpha grass ropes which bound him to his mount, they were surrounded by a mob of men, women and children. Many of the tribe, and more especially the women, appeared to take delight in heaping insults upon the prisoner, and some had even gone so far as to throw stones at him and strike him with sticks, when an old sheikh appeared and drove them away. Ali Ben Ahmed tells me, he said, that this man sat alone in the mountains and slew El Adria. What the business of the stranger who sent us after him may be, I know not, and what he may do with this man when we turn him over to him, I care not, but the prisoner is a brave man. And while he is in our hands, he shall be treated with the respect that be due one who hunts the Lord with the large head alone and by night and slays him. Tarzan had heard of the respect in which Arabs held a lion killer, and he was not sorry that chance had played into his hands thus favorably to relieve him of the petty tortures of the tribe. Shortly after this he was taken to a goatskin tent upon the upper side of the douar. There he was fed, and then, securely bound, was left lying on a piece of native carpet, alone in the tent. He could see a guard sitting before the door of his frail prison, but when he attempted to force the stout bonds that held him, he realized that any extra precaution on the part of his captors was quite unnecessary. Not even his giant muscles could part those numerous strands. Just before dusk, several men approached the tent where he lay and entered it. All were in Arab dress, but presently one of the number advanced to Tarzan's side, and as he let the folds of cloth that had hidden the lower half of his face fall away, the ape-man saw the malevolent features of Nicholas Rokoff. There was a nasty smile on the bearded lips. "Ah, Monsieur Tarzan," he said, "this is indeed a pleasure. But why do you not rise and greet your guest then?" With an ugly oath, "Get up, you dog," and drawing back his booted foot, he kicked Tarzan heavily in the side. "And here is another and another and another," he continued as he kicked Tarzan about the face and side, "one for each of the injuries you have done me." The ape-man made no reply. He did not even deign to look upon the Russian again after the first glance of recognition. Finally the sheikh, who had been standing a mute and frowning witness of the cowardly attack, intervened. "Stop," he commanded. "Kill him if you will, but I will see no brave man subjected to such indignities in my presence. I have half a mind to turn him loose, that I may see how long you would kick him then." This threat put a sudden end to Rokoff's brutality, for he had no craving to see Tarzan loosed from his bonds while he was within reach of those powerful hands. "Very well," he replied to the Arab, "I shall kill him presently." Not within the precincts of my douar, returned the sheik. When he leaves here, he leaves alive. What you do with him in the desert is none of my concern, but I shall not have the blood of a Frenchman on the hands of my tribe on account of another man's quarrel. They would send soldiers here and kill many of my people, and burn our tents and drive away our flocks. As you say, growled Rokoff, I'll take him out into the desert below the douar and dispatch him. You will take him a day's ride from my country, said the sheik firmly, and some of my children shall follow you to see that you do not disobey me, otherwise there may be 2 dead Frenchmen in the desert. Rokoff shrugged. Then I shall have to wait until the morrow. It is already dark. As you will, said the sheik, but by an hour after dawn you must be gone from my douar. I have little liking for unbelievers, and none at all for a coward. Rokoff would have made some kind of retort, but he checked himself, for he realized that it would require but little excuse for the old man to turn upon him. Together they left the tent. At the door, Rokoff could not resist the temptation to turn and fling a parting taunt at Tarzan. Sleep well, monsieur, he said, and do not forget to pray well, for when you die tomorrow it will be in such agony that you will be unable to pray for blaspheming. No one had bothered to bring Tarzan either food or water since noon, and consequently he suffered considerably from thirst. He wondered if it would be worthwhile to ask his guard for water, but after making 2 or 3 requests without receiving any response, he decided that it would not. Far up in the mountains he heard a lion roar. How much safer one was, he soliloquized, in the haunts of wild beasts than in the haunts of men. Never in all his jungle life had he been more relentlessly tracked down than in the past few months of his experience among civilized men. Never had he been any nearer death. Again the lion roared. It sounded a little nearer. Tarzan felt the old, wild impulse to reply with the challenge of his kind. His kind? He had almost forgotten that he was a man and not an ape. He tugged at his bonds. God, if he could but get them near those strong teeth of his. He felt a wild wave of madness sweep over him as his efforts to regain his liberty met with failure. Numa was roaring almost continually now. It was quite evident that he was coming down into the desert to hunt. It was the roar of a hungry lion. Tarzan envied him, for he was free. No one would tie him with ropes and slaughter him like a sheep. It was that which galled the ape-man. He did not fear to die. No, it was the humiliation of defeat before death, without even a chance to battle for his life. It must be near midnight, thought Tarzan. He had several hours to live. Possibly he would yet find a way to take Rokoff with him on the long journey. He could hear the savage lord of the desert quite close by now. Possibly he sought his meat from among the penned animals within the douar. For a long time silence reigned. Then Tarzan's trained ears caught the sound of a stealthily moving body. It came from the side of the tent nearest the mountains, the back. Nearer and nearer it came. He waited, listening intently, for it to pass. For a time there was silence without, such a terrible silence that Tarzan was surprised that he did not hear the breathing of the animal he felt sure must be crouching close to the back wall of his tent. There it is, moving again. Closer it creeps. Tarzan turns his head in the direction of the sound. It is very dark within the tent. Slowly the back rises from the ground, forced up by the head and shoulders of a body that looks all black in the semi-darkness. Beyond is a faint glimpse of the dimly starlit desert. A grim smile plays about Tarzan's lips. At least Rokoff will be cheated. How mad he will be. And death will be more merciful than he could have hoped for at the hands of the Russian. Now the back of the tent drops into place, and all is darkness again. Whatever it is inside the tent with him. He hears it creeping close to him. Now it is beside him. He closes his eyes and waits for the mighty paw. Upon his upturned face falls the gentle touch of a soft hand groping in the dark, and then a girl's voice in a scarcely audible whisper pronounces his name. Yes, it is I, he whispers in reply. But in the name of heaven, who are you? The owled nail of Ciciesa came the answer. While she spoke, Tarzan could feel her working about his bonds. Occasionally the cold steel of a knife touched his flesh. A moment later he was free. Come, she whispered. On hands and knees he followed her out of the tent by the way she had come. She continued crawling thus flat to the ground until she reached a little patch of shrub. There she halted until he gained her side. For a moment he looked at her before he spoke. I cannot understand, he said at last. Why are you here? How did you know that I was a prisoner in that tent? How does it happen that it is you who have saved me? She smiled. I have come a long way tonight, she said, and we have a long way to go before we shall be out of danger. Come, I shall tell you all about it as we go." Together they rose and set off across the desert in the direction of the mountains. "I was not quite sure that I should ever reach you," she said at last. "Edgar's abroad tonight, and after I left the horses I think he winded me and was following. I was terribly frightened." "What a brave girl," he said. "And you ran all that risk for a stranger, an alien, an unbeliever." She drew herself up very proudly. "I am the daughter of the Sheikh Kabur ben Sa'den," she answered. "I should be no fit daughter of his, if I would not risk my life to save that of the man who saved mine while he yet thought that I was but a common old nail." "Nevertheless," he insisted, "you are a very brave girl, but how did you know that I was a prisoner back there?" "Ahmed din Tayyib, who is my cousin on my father's side, was visiting some friends who belonged to the tribe that captured you. He was at the Dua when you were brought in. When he reached home, he was telling us about the big Frenchman who had been captured by Ali Ben Ahmed for another Frenchman who wished to kill him. From the description I knew that it must be you. My father was away. I tried to persuade some of the men to come and save you, but they would not do it, saying, 'Let the unbelievers kill one another if they wish. It is none of our affair. And if we go and interfere with Ali Ben Ahmed's plans, we shall only stir up a fight with our own people.' So when it was dark, I came alone, riding one horse and leading another for you. They are tethered not far from here. By morning we shall be within my father's douar. He should be there himself by now. Then let them come and try to take Kador ben Saden's friend." For a few moments they walked on in silence. "We should be near the horses," she said. "It is strange that I do not see them here." Then a moment later she stopped, with a little cry of consternation. "They are gone," she exclaimed. "It is here that I tethered them." Tarzan stooped to examine the ground. He found that a large shrub had been torn up by the roots. Then he found something else. There was a wry smile on his face as he rose and turned toward the girl. "Edgar has been here. From the signs, though, I rather think that his prey escaped him. With a little start, they would be safe enough from him in the open." There was nothing to do but continue on foot. The way led them across a low spur of the mountains, but the girl knew the trail as well as she did her mother's face. They walked in easy, swinging strides, Tarzan keeping a hand's breadth behind the girl's shoulder, that she might set the pace and thus be less fatigued. As they walked, they talked, occasionally stopping to listen for sounds of pursuit. It was now a beautiful moonlit night. The air was crisp and invigorating. Behind them lay the interminable vista of the desert, dotted here and there with an occasional oasis. The date palms of the little fertile spot they had just left, and the circle of goatskin tents, stood out in sharp relief against the yellow sand of phantom paradise upon a phantom sea. Before them rose the grim and silent mountains. Tarzan's blood leaped in his veins. This was life. He looked down upon the girl beside him, a daughter of the desert walking across the face of a dead world with a son of the jungle. He smiled at the thought. He wished that he had had a sister, and that she had been like this girl. What a bully chum she would have been. They had entered the mountains now and were progressing more slowly, for the trail was steeper and very rocky. For a few minutes they had been silent. The girl was wondering if they would reach her father's douar before the pursuit had overtaken them. Tarzan was wishing that they might walk on thus forever. If the girl were only a man, they might. He longed for a friend who loved the same wildlife that he loved. He had learned to crave companionship, but it was his misfortune that most of the men he knew preferred immaculate linen and their clubs to nakedness and the jungle. It was of course difficult to understand, yet it was very evident that they did. The two had just turned a projecting rock around which the trail ran when they were brought to a sudden stop. There, before them, directly in the middle of the path, stood Numa, Edgar, the black lion. His green eyes looked very wicked, and he bared his teeth and lashed his bay-black sides with his angry tail. Then he roared the fearsome, terror-inspiring roar of the hungry lion, which is also angry. "Your knife," said Tarzan to the girl, extending his hand. She slipped the hilt of the weapon into his waiting palm. As his fingers closed upon it, he drew her back and pushed her behind him. "Walk back to the desert as rapidly as you can. If you hear me call, you will know that all is well, and you may return." "It is useless," she replied resignedly. "This is the end." "Do as I tell you," he commanded. Quickly, he is about to charge. The girl dropped back a few paces, where she stood watching for the terrible sight that she knew she should soon witness. The lion was advancing slowly toward Tarzan, his nose to the ground, like a challenging bull. his tail extended now and quivering as though with intense excitement. The ape-man stood, half-crouching, the long Arab knife glistening in the moonlight. Behind him, the tense figure of the girl, motionless as a carven statue. She leaned slightly forward, her lips parted, her eyes wide. Her only conscious thought was wonder at the bravery of the man who dared face with a puny knife the Lord with the large head. A man of her own blood would have knelt in prayer and gone down beneath those awful fangs without resistance. In either case the result would be the same. It was inevitable, but she could not repress a thrill of admiration as her eyes rested upon the heroic figure before her. Not a tremor in the whole giant frame, his attitude as menacing and defiant as that of Edgar himself. The lion was quite close to him now, but a few paces intervened. He crouched, and then, with a deafening roar, he sprang. Chapter 11. John Caldwell, London. As Numa Edgar launched himself with widespread paws and bared fangs, he looked to find this puny man as easy prey as the score who had gone down beneath him in the past. To him, man was a clumsy, slow-moving, defenseless creature. He had little respect for him. But this time he found that he was pitted against a creature as agile and as quick as himself. When his mighty frame struck the spot where the man had been, he was no longer there. The watching girl was transfixed by astonishment at the ease with which the crouching man eluded the great paws. And now, oh Allah, he had rushed in behind Edgar's shoulder even before the beast could turn, and had grasped him by the mane. The lion reared upon his hind legs like a horse. Tarzan had known that he would do this, and he was ready. A giant arm encircled the black man's throat, and once, twice, a dozen times a sharp blade darted in and out of the bay black side behind the left shoulder. Frantic were the leaps of Numa, awful his roars of rage and pain, but the giant upon his back could not be dislodged or brought within reach of fangs or talons in the brief interval of life that remained to the Lord with the large head. He was quite dead when Tarzan of the apes released his hold and arose. Then the daughter of the desert witnessed a thing that terrified her even more than had the presence of Edgar. The man placed a foot upon the carcass of his kill, and with his handsome face raised toward the full moon, gave voice to the most frightful cry that ever had smote upon her ears. With a little cry of fear she shrank away from him. She thought that the fearful strain of the encounter had driven him mad. As the last note of that fiendish challenge died out in the diminishing echoes of the distance, the man dropped his eyes until they rested upon the girl. Instantly his face was lighted by the kindly smile that was ample assurance of his sanity, and the girl breathed freely once again, smiling in response. "What manner of man are you?" she asked. "The thing you have done is unheard of. Even now I cannot believe that it is possible for a lone man armed only with a knife to have fought hand-to-hand with Edgar and conquered him, unscathed to have conquered him at all. And that cry, it was not human. Why did you do that?" Tarzan flushed. "It is because I forget," he said, "sometimes that I am a civilized man. When I kill, it must be that I am another creature." He did not try to explain further, for it always seemed to him that a woman must look with loathing upon one who was yet so nearly a beast. Together they continued their journey. The sun was an hour high when they came out into the desert again beyond the mountains. Beside a little rivulet they found the girl's horses grazing. They had come this far on their way home, and with the cause of their fear no longer present, had stopped to feed. With little trouble Tarzan and the girl caught them, and mounting, rode out into the desert toward the douar of Sheikh Khadr ben Saadin. No sign of pursuit developed, and they came in safety about 9 o'clock to their destination. The sheikh had but just returned. He was frantic with grief at the absence of his daughter, whom he thought had been again abducted by the marauders. With 50 men he was already mounted to go in search of her when the two rode into the douar. His joy at the safe return of his daughter was only equaled by his gratitude to Tarzan for bringing her safely to him through the dangers of the night, and his thankfulness that she had been in time to save the man who had once saved her. No honor that Khadr ben Saadin could heap upon the ape-man in acknowledgement of his esteem and friendship was neglected. When the girl had recited the story of the slaying of Edgar, Tarzan was surrounded by a mob of worshipping Arabs. It was a sure road to their admiration and respect. The old sheikh insisted that Tarzan remain indefinitely as his guest. He even wished to adopt him as a member of the tribe, and there was for some time a half-formed resolution in the ape-man's mind to accept and remain forever with these wild people, whom he understood and who seemed to understand him. His friendship and liking for the girl were potent factors in urging him toward an affirmative decision. Had she been a man, he argued, he should not have hesitated, for it would have meant a friend after his own heart, with whom he could ride and hunt at will. But as it was, they would be hedged by the conventionalities that are even more strictly observed by the wild nomads of the desert than by their more civilized brothers and sisters. And in a little while she would be married to one of these swarthy warriors, and there would be an end to their friendship. So he decided against the Sheikh's proposal, though he remained a week as his guest. When he left, Kador Ben Saden and 50 white-robed warriors rode with him to Bosada. While they were mounting in the douar of Kador Ben Saden the morning of their departure, the girl came to bid farewell to Tarzan. "I have prayed that you would remain with us," she said simply as he leaned from his saddle to clasp her hand in farewell, "and now I shall pray that you will return." There was an expression of wistfulness in her beautiful eyes and a pathetic droop at the corners of her mouth. Tarzan was touched. "Who knows?" And then he turned and rode after the departing Arabs. Outside Busada, he bade Kador Ben Saden and his men goodbye, for there were reasons which made him wish to make his entry into the town as secret as possible, and when he had explained them to the Sheikh, the latter concurred in his decision. The Arabs were to enter Busada ahead of him, saying nothing as to his presence with them. Later, Tarzan would come in alone and go directly to an obscure native inn. Thus, making his entrance after dark as he did, he was not seen by anyone who knew him and reached the inn unobserved. After dining with Kador Ben Saden as his guest, he went to his former hotel by a roundabout way, and coming in by a rear entrance, sought the proprietor, who seemed much surprised to see him alive. Yes, there was mail for Monsieur, he would fetch it. No, he would mention Monsieur's return to no one. Presently he returned with a packet of letters. One was an order from his superior to lay off on his present work, and hasten to Cape Town by the first steamer he could get. His further instructions would be awaiting him there in the hands of another agent whose name and address were given. That was all brief but explicit. Tarzan arranged to leave Busada early the next morning. Then he started for the garrison to see Captain Gerard, whom the hotel man had told him had returned with his detachment the previous day. He found the officer in his quarters. He was filled with surprise and pleasure at seeing Tarzan alive and well. "When Lieutenant Gernois returned and reported that he had not found you at the spot that you had chosen to remain while the detachment was scouting, I was filled with alarm. We searched the mountain for days. Then came word that you had been killed and eaten by a lion. As proof, your gun was brought to us. Your horse had returned to camp the second day after your disappearance. We could not doubt. Lieutenant Gernois was grief-stricken. He took all the blame upon himself. It was he who insisted on carrying on the search himself. It was he who found the Arab with your gun. He will be delighted to know that you are safe." "Doubtless," said Tarzan, with a grim smile. "He is down in the town now, or I should send for him," continued Captain Gerard. "I shall tell him as soon as he returns." Tarzan let the officer think that he had been lost, wandering finally into the douar of Kador Ben Saden, who had escorted him back to Busada. As soon as possible he bade the good officer adieu, and hastened back into the town. At the native inn he had learned through Kador Ben Saden a piece of interesting information. It told of a black-bearded white man who went always disguised as an Arab. For a time he had nursed a broken wrist. More recently he had been away from Busada, but now he was back, and Tarzan knew his place of concealment. It was for there he headed. Through narrow, stinking alleys, black as Erebus, he groped, and then up a rickety stairway at the end of which was a closed door and a tiny, unglazed window. The window was high under the low eaves of the mud building. Tarzan could just reach the sill. He raised himself slowly until his eyes topped it. The room within was lighted, and at a table sat Rokoff and Gernois. Gernois was speaking. "Rokoff, you are a devil," he was saying. "You have hounded me until I have lost the last shred of my honor. You have driven me to murder, for the blood of that man Tarzan is on my hands. If it were not that that other devil's spawn, Polvich, still knew my secret, I should kill you here tonight with my bare hands." Rokoff laughed. "You would not do that, my dear lieutenant," he said. "The moment I am reported dead by assassination, the dear Alexis will forward to the Minister of War full proof of the affair you so ardently long to conceal, and further will charge you with my murder. Come, be sensible. I am your best friend. Have I not protected your honor as though it were my own?" Gernois sneered and spat out an oath. "Just one more little payment," continued Rokoff, "and the papers I wish, and you have my word of honor that I shall never ask another cent from you or further information." "And a good reason why," growled Gernois. "What you ask will take my last cent, and the only valuable military secret I hold. You ought to be paying me for the information instead of taking both it and money too." I am paying you by keeping a still tongue in my head, retorted Rukov. But let's have done. Will you or will you not? I give you 3 minutes to decide. If you are not agreeable, I shall send a note to your commandant tonight that will end in the degradation that Dreyfus suffered, the only difference being that he did not deserve it. For a moment Journois sat with bowed head. At length he arose. He drew 2 pieces of paper from his blouse. Here, he said hopelessly. I had them ready, for I knew that there could be but one outcome. He held them toward the Russian. Rukov's cruel face lighted in malignant gloating. He seized the bits of paper. You have done well, Journois, he said. I shall not trouble you again unless you happen to accumulate some more money or information, and he grinned. You never shall again, you dog, hissed Journois. The next time I shall kill you. I came near doing it tonight. For an hour I sat with these 2 pieces of paper on my table before me, ere I came here. Beside them lay my loaded revolver. I was trying to decide which I should bring. Next time the choice shall be easier. For I already have decided. You had a close call tonight, Rukov. Do not tempt fate a second time. Then Journois rose to leave. Tarzan barely had time to drop to the landing and shrink back into the shadows on the far side of the door. Even then he scarcely hoped to elude detection. The landing was very small, and though he flattened himself against the wall at its far edge, he was scarcely more than a foot from the doorway. Almost immediately it opened, and Journois stepped out. Rukov was behind him. Neither spoke. Journois had taken perhaps 3 steps down the stairway when he halted and half-turned, as though to retrace his steps. Tarzan knew that discovery would be inevitable. Rukov still stood on the threshold a foot from him, but he was looking in the opposite direction, toward Journois. Then the officer evidently reconsidered his decision and resumed his downward course. Tarzan could hear Rukov's sigh of relief. A moment later the Russian went back into the room and closed the door. Tarzan waited until Journois had had time to get well out of hearing. Then he pushed open the door and stepped into the room. He was on top of Rukov before the man could rise from the chair where he sat scanning the paper Journois had given him. As his eyes turned and fell upon the ape man's face, his own went livid. You, he gasped. I replied, Tarzan. What do you want? Whispered Rukov, for the look in the ape man's eyes frightened him. Have you come to kill me? You do not dare. They would guillotine you. You do not dare kill me. I dare kill you, Rukov, replied Tarzan, for no one knows that you are here or that I am here, and Polvich would tell them that it was Journois. I heard you tell Journois so, but that would not influence me, Rukov. I would not care who knew that I had killed you. The pleasure of killing you would more than compensate for any punishment they might inflict upon me. You are the most despicable cur of a coward, Rukov, I have ever heard of. You should be killed. I should be killed. I should love to kill you. And Tarzan approached closer to the man. Rukov's nerves were keyed to the breaking point. With a shriek he sprang toward an adjoining room, but the ape man was upon his back while his leap was yet but half completed. Iron fingers sought his throat. The great coward squealed like a stuck pig, until Tarzan had shut off his wind. Then the ape man dragged him to his feet, still choking him. The Russian struggled futilely. He was like a babe in the mighty grasp of Tarzan of the apes. Tarzan sat him in a chair, and long before there was danger of the man's dying, he released his hold upon his throat. When the Russian's coughing spell had abated, Tarzan spoke to him again. I have given you a taste of the suffering of death, he said. But I shall not kill this time. I am sparing you solely for the sake of a very good woman whose great misfortune it was to have been born of the same woman who gave birth to you. But I shall spare you only this once on her account, should I ever learn that you have again annoyed her or her. Husband, should you ever annoy me again, should I hear that you have returned to France or to any French possession, I shall make it my sole business to hunt you down and complete the choking I commenced tonight. Then he turned to the table, on which the 2 pieces of paper still lay. As he picked them up, Rukov gasped in horror. Tarzan examined both the check and the other. He was amazed at the information the latter contained. Rukov had partially read it, but Tarzan knew that no one could remember the salient facts and figures it held, which made it of real value to an enemy of France. These will interest the chief of staff, he said as he slipped them into his pocket. Rukov groaned. He did not dare curse aloud. The next morning Tarzan rode north on his way to Bouira and Algiers. As he had ridden past the hotel, Lieutenant Journois was standing on the veranda. As his eyes discovered Tarzan, he went white as chalk. The ape-man would have been glad had the meeting not occurred, but he could not avoid it. He saluted the officer as he rode past. Mechanically, Journois returned the salute, but those terrible wide eyes followed the horseman, expressionless except for horror. It was as though a dead man looked upon a ghost. At Sidi Issa, Tarzan met a French officer with whom he had become acquainted on the occasion of his recent sojourn in the town. "You left Bou Saada early?" questioned the officer. "Then you have not heard about poor Journois?" "He was the last man I saw as I rode away," replied Tarzan. "What about him?" "He is dead. He shot himself about 8 o'clock this morning." 2 days later, Tarzan reached Algiers. There he found that he would have a 2 days' wait before he could catch a ship bound for Cape Town. He occupied his time in writing out a full report of his mission. The secret papers he had taken from Rokoff he did not enclose, for he did not dare trust them out of his own possession until he had been authorized to turn them over to another agent, or himself return to Paris with them. As Tarzan boarded his ship after what seemed a most tedious wait to him, 2 men watched him from an upper deck. Both were fashionably dressed and smooth-shaven. The taller of the 2 had sandy hair, but his eyebrows were very black. Later in the day they chanced to meet Tarzan on deck, but as one hurriedly called his companion's attention to something at sea, their faces were turned from Tarzan as he passed, so that he did not notice their features. In fact, he had paid no attention to them at all. Following the instructions of his chief, Tarzan had booked his passage under an assumed name, John Caldwell, London. He did not understand the necessity of this, and it caused him considerable speculation. He wondered what role he was to play in Cape Town. Well, he thought, thank heaven that I am rid of Rokoff. He was commencing to annoy me. I wonder if I am really becoming so civilized that presently I shall develop a set of nerves. He would give them to me if anyone could, for he does not fight fair. One never knows through what new agency he is going to strike. It is as though Numa the lion had induced Tantor, the elephant, and Hista, the snake, to join him in attempting to kill me. I would then never have known what minute, or by whom, I was to be attacked next. But the brutes are more chivalrous than man, they do not stoop to cowardly intrigue. At dinner that night, Tarzan sat next to a young woman whose place was at the captain's left. The officer introduced them. Miss Strong. Where had he heard the name before? It was very familiar. And then the girl's mother gave him the clue, for when she addressed her daughter, she called her Hazel. Hazel Strong, what memories the name inspired. It had been a letter to this girl, penned by the fair hand of Jane Porter, that had carried to him the first message from the woman he loved. How vividly he recalled the night he had stolen it from the desk in the cabin of his long-dead father, where Jane Porter had sat writing it late into the night, while he crouched in the darkness without. How terror-stricken she would have been that night had she known that the wild jungle beast squatted outside her window, watching her every move. And this was Hazel Strong, Jane Porter's best friend. Chapter 12: Ships That Pass. Let us go back a few months to the little windswept platform of a railway station in northern Wisconsin. The smoke of forest fires hangs low over the surrounding landscape, its acrid fumes smarting the eyes of a little party of 6 who stand waiting the coming of the train that is to bear them away toward the south. Professor Archimedes Q. Porter, his hands clasped beneath the tails of his long coat, paces back and forth under the ever-watchful eye of his faithful secretary, Mr. Samuel T. Philander. Twice within the past few minutes he has started absent-mindedly across the tracks in the direction of a nearby swamp, only to be rescued and dragged back by the tireless Mr. Philander. Jane Porter, the professor's daughter, is in strained and lifeless conversation with William Cecil Clayton and Tarzan of the Apes. Within the little waiting room, but a bare moment before, a confession of love and a renunciation had taken place that had blighted the lives and happiness of 2 of the party, but William Cecil Clayton, Lord Greystoke, was not one of them. Behind Miss Porter hovered the motherly Esmeralda. She too was happy, for was she not returning to her beloved Maryland? Already she could see dimly through the fog of smoke the murky headlight of the oncoming engine. The men began to gather up the hand baggage. Suddenly Clayton exclaimed, "By Jove, I've left my ulster in the waiting room and hastened off to fetch it." "Goodbye, Jane," said Tarzan, extending his hand. "God bless you." "Goodbye," replied the girl faintly. "Try to forget me, no, not that I could not bear to think that you had forgotten me." "There is no danger of that, dear," he answered. "I wish to heaven that I might forget. It would be so much easier than to go through life always remembering what might have been. You will be happy, though. I am sure you shall. You must be. You may tell the others of my decision to drive my car on to New York. I don't feel equal to bidding Clayton goodbye. I want always to remember him kindly. But I fear that I am too much of a wild beast yet to be trusted too long with the man who stands between me and the one person in all the world I want. As Clayton stooped to pick up his coat in the waiting room, his eyes fell on a telegraph blank lying face down upon the floor. He stooped to pick it up, thinking it might be a message of importance which someone had dropped. He glanced at it hastily, and then suddenly he forgot his coat, the approaching train, everything but that terrible little piece of yellow paper in his hand. He read it twice before he could fully grasp the terrific weight of meaning that it bore to him. When he had picked it up, he had been an English nobleman, the proud and wealthy possessor of vast estates. A moment later he had read it, and he knew that he was an untitled and penniless beggar. It was Arnott's cablegram to Tarzan, and it read, "Fingerprints prove you Greystoke. Congratulations, Dia. Ake. He staggered as though he had received a mortal blow. Just then he heard the others calling to him to hurry. The train was coming to a stop at the little platform. Like a man dazed, he gathered up his ulster. He would tell them about the cablegram when they were all on board the train. Then he ran out upon the platform just as the engine whistled twice in the final warning that precedes the first rumbling jerk of coupling pins. The others were on board, leaning out from the platform of a Pullman, crying to him to hurry. Quite 5 minutes elapsed before they were settled in their seats, nor was it until then that Clayton discovered that Tarzan was not with them. "Where is Tarzan?" he asked Jane Porter. "In another car." "No," she replied. At the last minute he determined to drive his machine back to New York. He is anxious to see more of America than is possible from a car window. He is returning to France, you know. Clayton did not reply. He was trying to find the right words to explain to Jane Porter the calamity that had befallen him and her. He wondered just what the effect of his knowledge would be on her. Would she still wish to marry him to be plain Mrs. Clayton? Suddenly the awful sacrifice which one of them must make loomed large before his imagination. Then came the question, will Tarzan claim his own? The ape-man had known the contents of the message before he calmly denied knowledge of his parentage. He had admitted that Kala the ape was his mother. Could it have been for love of Jane Porter? There was no other explanation which seemed reasonable. Then, having ignored the evidence of the message, was it not reasonable to assume that he meant never to claim his birthright? If this were so, what right had he, William Cecil Clayton, to thwart the wishes, to balk the self-sacrifice of this strange man? If Tarzan of the Apes could do this thing to save Jane Porter from unhappiness, why should he, to whose care she was entrusting her whole future, do aught to jeopardize her interests? And so he reasoned until the first generous impulse to proclaim the truth and relinquish his titles and his estates to their rightful owner was forgotten beneath the mass of sophistries which self-interest had advanced. But during the balance of the trip, and for many days thereafter, he was moody and distraught. Occasionally the thought obtruded itself that possibly at some later day Tarzan would regret his magnanimity and claim his rights. Several days after they reached Baltimore, Clayton broached the subject of an early marriage to Jane. "What do you mean by early?" she asked. "Within the next few days. I must return to England at once. I want you to return with me, dear." "I can't get ready so soon as that," replied Jane. "It will take a whole month at least." She was glad, for she hoped that whatever called him to England might still further delay the wedding. She had made a bad bargain, but she intended carrying her part loyally to the bitter end if she could manage to secure a temporary reprieve, though she felt that she was warranted in doing so. His reply disconcerted her. "Very well, Jane," he said. "I am disappointed, but I shall let my trip to England wait a month, then we can go back together." But when the month was drawing to a close, she found still another excuse upon which to hang a postponement, until at last, discouraged and doubting, Clayton was forced to go back to England alone. The several letters that passed between them brought Clayton no nearer to a consummation of his hopes than he had been before, and so it was that he wrote directly to Professor Porter and enlisted his services. The old man had always favored the match. He liked Clayton, and being of an old Southern family, he put rather an exaggerated value on the advantages of a title, which meant little or nothing to his daughter. Clayton urged that the professor accept his invitation to be his guest in London, an invitation which included the professor's entire little family, Mr. Philander, Esmeralda and all, The Englishman argued that once Jane was there and home ties had been broken, she would not so dread the step which she had so long hesitated to take. So the evening that he received Clayton's letter, Professor Porter announced that they would leave for London the following week. But once in London, Jane Porter was no more tractable than she had been in Baltimore. She found one excuse after another, and when finally Lord Tennington invited the party to cruise around Africa in his yacht, she expressed the greatest delight in the idea, but absolutely refused to be married until they had returned to life. As the cruise was to consume a year at least, for they were to stop for indefinite periods at various points of interest, Clayton mentally anathematized Tennington for ever suggesting such a ridiculous trip. It was Lord Tennington's plan to cruise through the Mediterranean and the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, and thus down the east coast, putting in at every port that was worth the seeing. And so it happened that on a certain day 2 vessels passed in the Strait of Gibraltar. The smaller, trim white yacht was speeding toward the east, and on her deck sat a young woman who gazed with sad eyes upon a diamond-studded locket which she idly fingered. Her thoughts were far away in the dim, leafy fastness of a tropical jungle, and her heart was with her thoughts. She wondered if the man who had given her the beautiful bauble, that had meant so much more to him than the intrinsic value which he had not even known could ever have meant to him, was back in his savage forest. And upon the deck of the larger vessel, a passenger steamer passing toward the east, the man sat with another young woman, and the two idly speculated upon the identity of the dainty craft gliding so gracefully through the gentle swell of the lazy sea. When the yacht had passed, the man resumed the conversation that her appearance had broken off. "Yes," he said, "I like America very much. And that means, of course, that I like Americans, for a country is only what its people make it. I met some very delightful people while I was there. I recall one family from your own city, Miss Strong, whom I like particularly, Professor Porter and his daughter." "Jane Porter," exclaimed the girl. "Do you mean to tell me that you know Jane Porter? Why, she is the very best friend I have in the world. We were little children together. We have known each other for ages." "Indeed," he answered, smiling. "You would have difficulty in persuading anyone of the fact who had seen either of you." "I'll qualify the statement," then she answered with a laugh. "We have known each other for 2 ages, hers and mine. But seriously, we are as dear to each other as sisters, and now that I am going to lose her, I am almost heartbroken." "Going to lose her?" exclaimed Tarzan. "Why, what do you mean?" "Oh yes, I understand. You mean that now that she is married and living in England, you will seldom if ever see her." "Yes," replied she, "and the saddest part of it all is that she is not marrying the man she loves. Oh, it is terrible. Marrying from a sense of duty, I think it is perfectly wicked." And I told her so. I have felt so strongly on the subject that although I was the only person outside of blood relations who was to have been asked to the wedding, I would not let her invite me, for I should not have gone to witness the terrible mockery. But Jane Porter is peculiarly positive. She has convinced herself that she is doing the only honorable thing that she can do, and nothing in the world will ever prevent her from marrying Lord Greystoke, except Greystoke himself or death. "I am sorry for her," said Tarzan. "And I am sorry for the man she loves," said the girl, "for he loves her. I never met him, but from what Jane tells me, he must be a very wonderful person. It seems that he was born in an African jungle and brought up by fierce anthropoid apes. He had never seen a white man or woman until Professor Porter and his party were marooned on the coast right at the threshold of his tiny cabin. He saved them from all manner of terrible beasts and accomplished the most wonderful feats imaginable. And then, to cap the climax, he fell in love with Jane, and she with him, though she never really knew it for sure until she had promised herself to Lord Greystoke." "Most remarkable," murmured Tarzan, cudgelling his brain for some pretext upon which to turn the subject. He delighted in hearing Hazel Strong talk of Jane, but when he was the subject of the conversation, he was bored and embarrassed. But he was soon given a respite, for the girl's mother joined them, and the talk became general. The next few days passed uneventfully. The sea was quiet. The sky was clear. The steamer ploughed steadily on toward the south without pause. Tarzan spent quite a little time with Miss Strong and her mother. They whiled away their hours on deck reading, talking, or taking pictures with Miss Strong's camera. When the sun had set, they walked. One day Tarzan found Miss Strong in conversation with a stranger, a man he had not seen on board before. As he approached the couple, the man bowed to the girl and turned to walk away. "Wait, Monsieur Tarzan," said Miss Strong, "you must meet Mr. Caldwell." We are all fellow passengers and should be acquainted." The two men shook hands. As Tarzan looked into the eyes of Monsieur Tarzan, he was struck by the strange familiarity of their expression. "I have had the honor of Monsieur's acquaintance in the past, I am sure," said Tarzan, "though I cannot recall the circumstances." Monsieur Tarzan appeared ill at ease. "I cannot say, monsieur," he replied. "It may be so. I have had that identical sensation myself when meeting a stranger." "Monsieur Tarzan has been explaining some of the mysteries of navigation to me," explained the girl. Tarzan paid little heed to the conversation that ensued. He was attempting to recall where he had met Monsieur Tarzan before. That it had been under peculiar circumstances, he was positive. Presently the sun reached them, and the girl asked Monsieur Tarzan to move her chair farther back into the shade. Tarzan happened to be watching the man at the time, and noticed the awkward manner in which he handled the chair. His left wrist was stiff. That clue was sufficient. A sudden train of associated ideas did the rest. Monsieur Tarzan had been trying to find an excuse to make a graceful departure. The lull in the conversation following the moving of their position gave him an opportunity to make his excuses. Bowing low to Miss Strong, and inclining his head to Tarzan, he turned to leave them. "Just a moment," said Tarzan. "If Miss Strong will pardon me, I will accompany you. I shall return in a moment, Miss Strong." Monsieur Tarzan looked uncomfortable. When the two men had passed out of the girl's sight, Tarzan stopped, laying a heavy hand on the other's shoulder. "What is your game now, Rokoff?" he asked. "I am leaving France, as I promised you," replied the other, in a surly voice. "I see you are," said Tarzan, "but I know you so well that I can scarcely believe that your being on the same boat with me is purely a coincidence. If I could believe it, the fact that you are in disguise would immediately disabuse my mind of any such idea." "Well," growled Rokoff with a shrug, "I cannot see what you are going to do about it. This vessel flies the English flag. I have as much right on board her as you, and from the fact that you are booked under an assumed name, I imagine that I have more right." "We will not discuss it, Rokoff. All I wanted to say to you is that you must keep away from Miss Strong. She is a decent woman." Rokoff turned scarlet. "If you don't, I shall pitch you overboard," continued Tarzan. "Do not forget that I am just waiting for some excuse." Then he turned on his heel and left Rokoff standing there trembling with suppressed rage. He did not see the man again for days, but Rokoff was not idle. In his stateroom with Polvich he fumed and swore, threatening the most terrible of revenges. "I would throw him overboard tonight," he cried, "were I sure that those papers were not on his person. I cannot chance pitching them into the ocean with him. If you were not such a stupid coward, Alexis, you would find a way to enter his stateroom and search for the documents." Polvich smiled. "You are supposed to be the brains of this partnership, my dear Nicholas," he replied. "Why do you not find the means to search Monsieur Caldwell's stateroom, eh?" 2 hours later fate was kind to them, for Polvich, who was ever on the watch, saw Tarzan leave his room without locking the door. 5 minutes later Rokoff was stationed where he could give the alarm in case Tarzan returned, and Polvich was deftly searching the contents of the ape-man's luggage. He was about to give up in despair when he saw a coat which Tarzan had just removed. A moment later he grasped an official envelope in his hand. A quick glance at its contents brought a broad smile to the Russian's face. When he left the stateroom, Tarzan himself could not have told that an article in it had been touched since he left it. Polvich was a past master in his chosen field. When he handed the packet to Rokoff in the seclusion of their stateroom, the larger man rang for a steward and ordered a pint of champagne. "We must celebrate, my dear Alexis," he said. "It was luck," Nicholas explained Polvich. "It is evident that he carries these papers always upon his person. Just by chance he neglected to transfer them when he changed coats a few minutes since, but there will be the deuce to pay when he discovers his loss. I am afraid that he will immediately connect you with it. Now that he knows that you are on board, he will suspect you at once." "It will make no difference whom he suspects after tonight," said Rokoff with a nasty grin. After Miss Strong had gone below that night, Tarzan stood leaning over the rail looking far out to sea. Every night he had done this since he had come on board. Sometimes he stood thus for an hour. And the eyes that had been watching his every movement since he had boarded the ship at Algiers knew that this was his habit. Even as he stood there this night, those eyes were on him. Presently the last straggler had left the deck. It was a clear night, but there was no moon. Objects on deck were barely discernible. From the shadows of the cabin, two figures crept stealthily upon the ape-man from behind. The lapping of the waves against the ship's sides, the whirring of the propeller, the throbbing of the engines, drowned the almost soundless approach of the two. They were quite close to him now, and crouching low, like tacklers on a gridiron. One of them raised his hand and lowered it, as though counting off seconds 1, 2, 3. As one man, the two leapt for their victim. Each grasped a leg, and before Tarzan of the Apes, lightning though he was, could turn to save himself, he had been pitched over the low rail and was falling into the Atlantic. Hazel Strong was looking from her darkened port across the dark sea. Suddenly a body shot past her eyes from the deck above. It dropped so quickly into the dark waters below that she could not be sure of what it was. It might have been a man, she could not say. She listened for some outcry from above, for the always fearsome call, "Man overboard," but it did not come. All was silence on the ship above, all was silence in the sea below. The girl decided that she had but seen a bundle of refuse thrown overboard by one of the ship's crew, and a moment later sought her berth.